Don't touch me. People like you always ruin things. The words didn't just land. They echoed, sharp and cold, slicing through the soft jazz and low conversations of the rooftop restaurant like glass cracking under pressure. Forks paused midair. A glass of $300 Cabernet hovered inches from a man's lips. No one moved. At the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, 6'2", tailored charcoal suit, the kind that whispered power without needing to shout, his jaw tight, eyes fixed not on a person, but on a problem he believed needed correcting. And in front of him, perfectly still, was Naomi Brooks. Black apron, clean white shirt, hands steady despite the tremor running through the room. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't speak, because she had heard worse. Because silence, for her, wasn't weakness, it was control. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind them, glittering like a promise only some people were allowed to keep. Inside, the air shifted. Guests glanced at each other, then away, pretending this was normal, that this was just how power sounded when it got comfortable. Daniel exhaled sharply, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve like he was erasing her presence altogether. Just bring another bottle, he added, dismissive, already turning back to the table where an $80 million acquisition sat waiting in neat stacks of paper and quiet ambition. Naomi nodded once, a movement so small it could have been missed, and stepped forward to adjust the bottle beside him. Her eyes flicked, just once, toward the documents. Numbers. Terms. A clause buried deep enough that no one at that table had noticed it. Not the investors. Not the attorneys. Not even Daniel Carter, the man who built his empire on catching what others missed. The room breathed again, slowly, cautiously, as if the moment had passed. But Naomi didn't move away. Not yet. Because something in that contract didn't sit right. Something that didn't belong. And as Daniel reached for his pen, ready to sign, confident, untouchable, she spoke. Quiet, steady, just loud enough to be heard. You might want to check page 17. The words didn't rise. They didn't demand attention. But they took it anyway. Daniel's hand paused midair. A fraction of a second. Barely noticeable. Unless you were watching closely. And Naomi Brooks always was. Daniel Carter did not look at her at first, because men like him did not look at waitresses when they spoke, but his hand stayed frozen above the paper, pen hovering, the weight of $80 million suddenly balanced on a single sentence spoken by someone he had already dismissed, and that was enough to make the room shift again, subtle but undeniable, like a pressure drop before a storm, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his head, his expression not angry yet, not curious either, but something sharper, something closer to irritation mixed with disbelief, as if the world had just stepped out of line. What did you just say? He asked, his voice lower now, controlled, the kind of tone that usually ended conversations instead of starting them. But Naomi did not step back. She did not apologize. She did not shrink the way people expected her to. She simply met the edge of his gaze without fully lifting her eyes, professional, composed, but unshaken. Page 17, she repeated softly. The acquisition clause, subsection B. And now the words were no longer just sound. They were direction, precise, deliberate. And for a brief second, no one breathed. One of the investors leaned forward, another adjusted his glasses, and Daniel, against his own instinct, flipped the page, the crisp paper cutting through the silence as clearly as the first insult had minutes earlier. And there it was, buried under legal language and polished formatting, a number that did not match, a term that shifted liability in a way that no one had caught, not his legal team, not his analysts, not the partner sitting across from him who suddenly looked very interested in his own glass of wine. And Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but Naomi saw it, because she had been watching from the moment he walked in, watching how he spoke, how he dismissed, how he assumed. And now for the first time that night, Daniel Carter was not the one controlling the room. That is not possible, he said, but the confidence in his voice had cracked, just enough to let doubt in, and doubt, in rooms like this, spread faster than fire. One of the attorneys leaned in, whispering, flipping through a second copy, confirming what should not have been there but clearly was, and the energy shifted again, heavier now, real, because this was no longer about a waitress speaking out of turn, this was about a mistake. that could cost millions, reputations, leverage. And suddenly the man who had dismissed her like background noise was standing in the center of a problem only she had seen coming. And Naomi, still holding the wine bottle, still standing exactly where she had been told she did not belong, spoke one more time, just as calm, just as steady. It changes the entire deal. The words did not echo, but they settled, heavy and irreversible, like a door closing in slow motion. And for the first time that night, no one reached for their drink, no one checked their phone, because the balance of power had shifted and everyone felt it. Daniel Carter straightened slightly, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something familiar, something solid. But the paper in front of him was no longer solid. It was unstable, unpredictable, and that made him dangerous in a different way, quieter, sharper. "Explain," he said, not to his legal team, not to the investors, but to her. And that alone was enough to send a ripple through the room, because moments ago she had not been worth a glance, and now she had his full attention. Naomi did not rush. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply set the wine bottle down with care, aligning it perfectly with the others, a small act of control in a room that had lost its center. Then she reached, not touching the contract, but indicating the exact line with a subtle motion of her hand. "The liability transfer," she said, her voice even, measured. "It activates under a condition that has already been met." One of the attorneys leaned closer, scanning quickly, his expression tightening as the realization caught up with him. Another investor shifted in his seat, the quiet confidence from earlier now replaced with calculation, and Daniel followed the line, reading. Again, slower this time. Not as a man skimming for confirmation, but as a man searching for what he missed. And there it was, undeniable, a clause that flipped the risk entirely, a detail that could turn a winning deal into a public failure. And suddenly the room was no longer his. It belonged to the truth sitting on that page, and to the woman who had seen it first. "Why did no one catch this?" someone muttered under their breath. But no one answered, because the answer was already standing there, dressed in black and white. Underestimated and overlooked, Naomi Brooks did not look around for validation. She did not wait for praise, because that was not why she spoke. She had learned long ago that being right did not always come with recognition. But tonight was different. Tonight the cost of ignoring her was too high. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried the weight of recalculation, of pride adjusting to reality. And when he finally looked at her again, really looked this time, it was not with dismissal, but with something far more complicated, something closer to respect mixed with disbelief. "How did you see that?" he asked, and the question was not casual, it was precise, because men like him only asked when the answer mattered. Naomi met the moment the same way she had met the insult, without hesitation, without apology. "Because I read what others skip," she said quietly. And in that sentence, simple as it was, the entire room understood that the woman they had ignored was never invisible. They had just chosen not to see her, and now they could not look away. The room did not return to normal, because something irreversible had already happened, and everyone felt it in the way they sat a little straighter, in the way their eyes no longer slid past Naomi, as if she were part of the furniture. Daniel Carter leaned back slowly, not in relaxation but in recalibration, his mind moving faster than his expression allowed, because men like him did not rise by ignoring mistakes. They rose by controlling them, but control required clarity, and right now, the clearest voice in the room had come from the one person he had dismissed. One of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to regain ground. "We should pause the signing," he said, carefully, diplomatically, but the suggestion carried weight, and Daniel did not interrupt, which was its own kind of answer. The attorney beside him was already flipping pages again, marking sections, whispering under his breath, confirming the exposure, the numbers, the implications, and with every second, the cost of what had almost happened grew larger, heavier, more public. Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her posture unchanged, as if the storm she had shifted was not hers to own, and in a way, it was not. She had simply revealed what was already there. Daniel's gaze returned to her, sharper now, more focused, not as a man looking down, but as a man trying to understand the variable he had missed. "You read contracts?" he asked, the question simple, but loaded, because it did not fit the narrative he had built about her in the first 5 seconds of meeting her. Naomi's answer came without hesitation. "Every night," she said, and that was when the room shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, because now there was a story behind the moment, something that extended beyond this table, beyond this deal, and Daniel noticed it, the steadiness in her voice, the absence of performance. She was not trying to impress anyone, which made it impossible to dismiss her. "Why?" he pressed, and the question hung there, not aggressive, but genuine in a way that surprised even him. Naomi glanced briefly at the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching, wide and indifferent, then back to the table. "Because details decide who wins," she said, and there was no pride in it, just truth, the kind of truth that did not need volume to carry weight. One of the investors let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not out of humor, out of realization, because the irony was now impossible to ignore. A room full of experts, advisors, executives, all paid to catch what mattered. And the one person who did had been the one they nearly erased, Daniel's. Fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion, but it carried decision. He closed the contract slowly, deliberately, the sound final, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, but different, stripped of the casual arrogance that had filled it before. "We are not signing tonight," he said, and no one argued, because the authority was still his. But the reason behind it was no longer what it had been when the night began, and for the first time since she stepped into that room, Naomi Brooks was no longer invisible. She was the reason everything had stopped. The decision settled over the table like a verdict, quiet but absolute. And for a moment no one spoke because everyone understood what had just been avoided, not just a flawed deal, but a mistake that would have followed them into headlines, into boardrooms, into reputations that took decades to build and seconds to fracture. One of the investors leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. Another closed his folder with careful hands, no longer eager, no longer certain, and Daniel Carter remained still at the center of it all, his posture composed, but his silence heavier now, because control had not been lost, it had been redirected, and that difference mattered more than anyone in the room could say out loud. His eyes moved once more to Naomi, not quickly, not dismissively, but with intention, studying her the way he would study a market shift or a competitor he had underestimated. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question carried weight because it should have been the first thing he asked, not the last. Naomi met it without hesitation. "Naomi Brooks," she said, her voice the same as before, steady, unshaken, as if nothing in the room had changed for her even though everything had. Daniel nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but it landed differently than his earlier gestures, because this one was earned, not assumed. "Naomi," he repeated, as if committing it to memory, and then his gaze shifted briefly to the others at the table, to the attorneys, the investors, the people who had built entire careers on precision and oversight. "We missed it," he said plainly, not assigning blame, not deflecting, just stating a fact that no one could argue with. And that was when the discomfort deepened, not because of the mistake, but because of who had caught it. The quiet hierarchy of the room had been rearranged without permission, and everyone felt the imbalance. Naomi did not step into that space. She did not claim it. She simply reached for the bottle again, continuing her work with the same calm rhythm, pouring wine into glasses that were now held a little more carefully, a little more respectfully, and that contrast, that return to simplicity after such a shift, made the moment even louder. Daniel watched it, the way she moved, the way she did not linger in the attention she had just earned, and something in that restraint held his focus longer than the mistake itself, because it was not what he expected. "You should not be doing this job," he said suddenly, the words leaving his mouth before they were softened, not an insult this time, but not quite a compliment either, something in between, something unfinished. Naomi paused just long enough to acknowledge the statement, her eyes lifting slightly, not defensive, not impressed, just present. "This job pays my bills," she replied, simple, direct, and in that answer there was no apology, no explanation beyond what mattered. and Daniel leaned back again, this time with a different kind of silence, because for the first time that night, he was not the one teaching a lesson. He was the one being forced to learn one, and the room, still and watchful, knew it. The words lingered longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they were true, and truth had a way of unsettling rooms built on assumption. Daniel Carter watched Naomi for a moment that stretched just beyond comfort, as if recalculating not just the deal, but the entire narrative he had constructed in his mind within the first few seconds of seeing her. The narrative that told him who mattered and who did not. And now that narrative had a crack in it, small but undeniable. One of the investors cleared his throat again, trying to pull the evening back into familiar structure. "We can reconvene next week after revisions," he suggested, his voice cautious, measured, but no one immediately responded, because the focus had shifted away from the deal itself and towards something less tangible but far more disruptive, perception. Daniel finally looked away from Naomi and toward the skyline, the city lights reflecting in the glass like a grid of possibilities. But his mind was not on the view. It was on the moment, replaying it, the sentence, the pause, the realization, and more importantly, the mistake that came before all of it, the assumption. He reached for his glass but did not drink, setting it back down with quiet precision. "How long have you been working here?" he asked without turning back, the question casual on the surface but deliberate underneath. Naomi answered without hesitation. 8 months. And there was no embellishment, no attempt to make the number sound like more than it was. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing it. 8 months in a room like this meant 8 months of watching, listening, understanding patterns that others ignored because they believed they were above being observed. And before that? He asked, and this time his voice shifted, less controlled, more curious, as if the answer mattered in a way he had not expected. Naomi adjusted a glass at the edge of the table, aligning it with the others before speaking. "Community college," she said, "business and finance." And that was when a subtle shift moved through the room again, quieter than before, but deeper, because now the pieces were connecting, the observation, the precision, the confidence without arrogance. It was not accidental. It was built. Daniel turned back to her fully now, his attention no longer divided, no longer filtered through status or role, just direct, focused. "Did you finish?" he asked, and the question carried something new, not judgment, but interest. Naomi met it the same way she had met everything else, steady, grounded. "No," she said. "I stopped when my mother got sick." And the sentence was simple, but it carried weight, not as a story meant to impress, but as a fact that explained everything without asking for sympathy. The room did not react outwardly, but something shifted internally, because now the image they had of her, the one built on uniform and assumption, no longer held. Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his expression unreadable, but his silence different, because now he was not just seeing her, he was understanding what it meant to have overlooked her, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more impact than anything that had been said all night. No one spoke immediately after that, because the weight of what had just been revealed did not need commentary. It needed space, and the room gave it, not out of courtesy, but out of recognition. Daniel Carter rested his forearms lightly against the table, his fingers interlocked now, a subtle shift from control to consideration, and for a man who built his reputation on never missing leverage, the realization settled deeper than any financial risk ever could, because numbers could be fixed, contracts could be rewritten, but perception, once exposed, was harder to recover. "You stopped," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement he was trying to understand. Naomi gave a small nod, her attention returning to the table, adjusting a glass that did not need adjusting, a quiet habit that kept her grounded in a space that had suddenly become unfamiliar in a different way. "Yes," she said, and left it there, because she did not owe anyone the full story. Not here. Not like this. One of the investors shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now, not with Naomi, but with the mirror the moment was holding up to all of them, because they had all seen her, and chosen not to see her. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried decision, not about the deal that had already been made, but about something else, something more personal, more immediate. "Do you still read contracts?" he asked, and the question, simple as it sounded, carried a different tone now, not curiosity for the sake of conversation, but intent. Naomi met it without hesitation. Every chance I get, she replied, and there was no pride in the answer, just discipline. The kind that did not ask for recognition because it had never received it. Daniel nodded once, then reached for the contract again, not to sign, but to close it completely, sliding it away from the center of the table as if acknowledging that this version of the night was over. Good, he said quietly, and then he paused, just long enough for the room to lean in without realizing it. Because I have a feeling you have been seeing things people like me have been missing for a long time. The sentence did not raise his voice, but it carried further than anything he had said before, not because of volume, but because of what it admitted, and that admission shifted something deeper than the deal itself. One of the attorneys glanced at Naomi now, not dismissively, but with something closer to respect. Another investor gave a slight nod, subtle, but real, and Naomi, standing there in the same uniform, in the same position she had been in from the start, did not react the way the moment might have invited. She did not smile. She did not step forward. She simply acknowledged it with a calm, measured presence, because for her, this was not a transformation. It was a correction. Daniel watched her for a second longer, then leaned back, his expression composed, but no longer closed. And in that quiet shift, the balance of the room changed again, not through force, not through money, but through something far more rare in spaces like this, recognition. The room did not erupt. It did not celebrate, because moments like this were not loud. They were precise, and the precision was what made them unforgettable. Daniel Carter reached for his glass again, but this time he took a slow sip, not out of habit, but out of pause, as if allowing the weight of the moment to fully settle before deciding what came next. Across the table, the lead investor adjusted his cufflinks, a subtle gesture that masked a deeper shift, because the power he thought he understood had just been redefined in front of him. We will need a revised structure, he said carefully, directing his words toward Daniel, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi, acknowledging, even if quietly, where the real turning point had come from. Daniel set the glass down with controlled ease, the sound soft but deliberate, and nodded once. We will, he replied, his voice steady, but stripped of the casual dominance it carried earlier. Now it was focused, intentional, and grounded in something more real than ego. The attorneys were already reorganizing documents, their earlier confidence replaced with sharper attention, every page now scrutinized, every number questioned, because the illusion of certainty had been broken, and no one wanted to be the next one who missed what mattered. Naomi stepped slightly back from the table, not retreating, but giving space as the room recalibrated around the truth she had revealed, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if none of this altered who she was or what she came there to do. And that was what made it even more powerful. She had not stepped into their world to prove something. She had simply brought clarity to it. Daniel's gaze returned to her once more, not out of curiosity now, but out of recognition that carried weight. Naomi, he said, and the room stilled again, because his tone had shifted into something deliberate, something that suggested this was not the end of the moment, but the beginning of something else. When your shift ends, he continued, pausing just enough to make every word land. I would like to speak with you. The sentence was simple, but it carried implication, not of charity, not of favor, but of opportunity, and that difference mattered. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable, not impressed, not intimidated, just present, and after a brief moment, she gave a small nod. I finish at 11, she said, her voice steady as ever. And that was all. No anticipation, no assumption, just fact. Daniel nodded once in return, accepting it without adding anything more, because whatever came next did not belong to this table, not to this deal, but to a different conversation entirely. The investors exchanged subtle glances, the kind that spoke without words, because they understood. What had just happened was bigger than a corrected contract. It was a shift in who held value in a room like this. Naomi turned slightly, resuming her role with the same quiet efficiency, moving between tables, adjusting glasses, refilling water, but now the eyes that followed her were different, not dismissive, not indifferent, but aware, and Daniel Carter sitting at the center of a deal that no longer mattered the way it had an hour ago, watched her walk away with a focus he could not ignore. Because for the first time that night, he knew exactly who had changed everything. By the time the clock neared 11, the restaurant had softened into a quieter rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into low conversations and the gentle clink of glass against glass. But something invisible had already been rewritten in that space, something no one could quite name. Naomi Brooks moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady pace, clearing tables, aligning silverware, finishing what she started without pause or performance, because for her, the night was still a shift, not a turning point. Not yet. Daniel Carter remained seated longer than expected, his table cleared, the contract gone, the investors dismissed with quiet efficiency. But he did not leave. He watched, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that revealed intention, because men like him did not wait without reason. And when Naomi finally stepped away from her last table, removing her apron with calm precision, he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to meet her at eye level without distance. "You kept your word," he said, and the sentence was simple, but it carried respect, not the kind spoken for appearance, but the kind earned in silence. Naomi nodded slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded. "I always do," she replied, and there was no edge in her voice, no need to remind him of earlier, because the moment had already spoken for itself. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if setting aside something he no longer needed, and for the first time that night, his next words were not shaped by control, but by clarity. "I misjudged you," he said, direct, unpolished, and in that admission there was no defense, no explanation, just truth, the kind that did not come easily to people in his position. Naomi did not react with surprise, because she had seen that shift long before he said it out loud. She simply met the moment with the same quiet composure. "That happens," she said, not dismissive, not forgiving, just real. And for a second, Daniel almost smiled, not because it was light, but because it was honest. "I run a firm that values precision," he continued, his tone steady, but different now. "And tonight, the most precise person in the room was not on my payroll." The statement hung between them, not as an offer, but as an acknowledgement of something undeniable. Naomi listened without interrupting, because she understood what was being said beneath the words: opportunity, but also expectation, and those two things were never separate. Daniel took a small step closer, not imposing, but intentional. "If you ever decide you want to finish what you started," he said, referring to something deeper than a degree, "there is a place where that kind of attention to detail is not overlooked." Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not measuring the offer, but measuring the man standing in front of her now against the one who had spoken hours earlier. And the difference was clear, not perfect, not complete, but real. She nodded once, not as acceptance, not as refusal, but as acknowledgement. "I will think about it," she said, and that was enough. Because for the first time that night, the outcome was not about control, it was about choice. And as Daniel stepped back, giving her space rather than taking it, the city lights behind them reflected something quieter than power, something steadier than wealth, something that could not be bought or forced, only recognized. And Naomi Brooks, who had walked into that room unseen, walked out with something far more valuable than attention. She walked out with her worth unchanged, finally seen. And in that silence, the lesson remained, clear and unshaken. Power can fill a room, but dignity is what transforms it.